All right, last week we had no class because we had a special presentation by our young people. Prior to that, we were talking about anti-Semitism and Christianity. And I was up to the point where we had gotten into Martin Luther, and just to kind of give you a little bit of background, the whole reason we had gotten there was, well, I haven't actually explained that yet, but I was looking at artwork, statues, stained glass windows, woodcuts, how the Jewish people had been portrayed for centuries, mostly in the Middle Ages, and how they were blamed for so much of what went wrong, whether it be the bubonic plague, the Black Death, bad water, and they were accused of even some of the silliest of things, such as stealing the wafers of the Catholic Church communion service and then stabbing them. And here's a portrayal. There's some of the wafers. And some of this actually got to the point where people were actually killed. Jews were killed. Here's kind of some woodcuts showing an actual account where there were hosts, these wafers stolen, and the Jews were accused, and they were accused of using them in their worship services, and even to the point where you'd put this in stained glass as a memorial for everybody to see in cathedrals. I mean, this is some crazy stuff, and it definitely does not portray the Jews in a favorable light. And I had suggested, what if today Springfield, Ohio had changed their mural here to something that portrayed Haitians in a negative light, such as eating dogs and eating cats? What would happen if that mural stayed up for hundreds and hundreds of years? Definitely it would affect how people viewed this particular race or this particular nationality. And here's another example of the Jews being burned to death as a result of some of these crazy accusations. They were also accused of stealing infants and killing them so they could drain blood from the infants so they can mix the blood into their matzah bread for Passover. So that was kind of a background leading us up to Martin Luther. And I haven't really explained why I brought Martin Luther into the discussion here as far as anti-Semitism. Tried to explain a little bit about Martin Luther. He was a reformer, lived in the 16th century, early 16th century. If you don't know who Martin Luther is, you've been under a stone for quite a while. He had left the Roman Catholic Church. His hope was to reform it. That didn't work out. And you could say he created his own Reformation movement. And I share some writings early on in his life, which you have to, when you read these, pat him on the back and commend him for his insight. So this is one of these quotes. Absurd theologians defend hatred for the Jews. What Jew would consent to enter our ranks, referring to the ranks of Christianity? What Jew would consent to enter our ranks when he sees the cruelty and enmity we wreak on them, that in our behavior towards them, we less resemble Christians than beasts? I read that, and one of the few things I would commend Martin Luther on is observations and slap him on the back. This is spot on. He could see what was going on around him for centuries and how the Christians were responsible for so much of the misery of the Jewish people. In fact, you cannot find anti-Semitism in places where there is no Christianity. You could also add Islam, but even prior to the rise of Islam, there would not have been anti-Semitism if there wasn't Christians there egging on these hatred behaviors and thoughts toward the Jewish people. So here's a longer quote from Martin Luther. Make sure I got it synced here. He says, "If I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. They," referring to the Christians of past, "they have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, they show them nothing of Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to popishness and mockery. If the apostles, who were also Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. When we are inclined to boast of our position as Christians, we should remember that we are but Gentiles, while the Jews are of the lineage of Christ. We, Gentiles, are aliens and in-laws. They, the Jews, are blood relatives, cousins, and brothers of our Lord. Therefore, if one is to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews are actually nearer to Christ than we are. If we really want to help them, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. If some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? After all, we ourselves are not all good Christians either." Luther's thinking when he's writing this early on in his life was that the Jews for centuries had been disgusted and repulsed by the many teachings of the Catholic Church. Probably the foremost would have been the doctrine of the Trinity. And if the Jews could only hear the quote-unquote pure gospel as told from Martin Luther's perspective, well, then the Jews would have a change of heart and embrace Christianity. This at least is what Martin Luther was thinking very early on in his life, that they would embrace Martin Luther's Protestant brand of Christianity, and the Jews have been obstinate for so long simply because the Catholic Church was all that they had to see as far as Christianity, and they didn't like that. So Martin Luther comes along, tries to reform Christianity of the Christian Church, and he's like thinking, okay, the Jews are going to see the light here. Just give me a little bit of time to work with them. Let me get some of my teachings or writings out. This was kind of, unfortunately, a naive idea that he had. I think he wrote these words about the age 40. And if Martin Luther had died at this age, with this being probably the last thing he had written, I would probably be a fan, maybe even a Lutheran for that matter, because this is really spot on stuff. He could really see what was at the heart of anti-Semitism, that is the Christian church, as hard as that is to accept. But the fact is, Martin Luther did not die at age 40. He lived to the ripe old age of 62, 22 years. In those 22 years, after he wrote these words, a lot, in capital letters, a lot changed in Martin Luther's thinking. And I think this is where I left you all 2 weeks ago, if you recall that. So that kind of brings us back up to speed. What happened in the 22 years that intervened between the time he wrote this and what I'm about to share with you? Things did not go very well as far as his attempt to convert the Jewish people to Christianity. He was, again, a bit naive in his thinking, although he was spot on in observing what the problem was. That is the behavior of the Christians. So this gets into the dark side of Martin Luther, part of what happens in those 22 years. Three years before Martin Luther died, again, he lived to be 62. 3 years before Martin Luther died, he wrote a pamphlet. You can see the pamphlet up above, titled, anyone here speak German? Not well? You can't? Okay. Well, I'll help you out. So the German version is Vom Shem Hamforas, which is a mashup using German and Hebrew words. Vom Shem, let's see if I got it up there. It's kind of hard to see because simply it's using, an ancient German Gothic font, but that's the title up there, Von Shem Hamforas. And in English, it translates to of the inexpressible name. And the Shem, I believe, would be the name part. I think you even see in Hebrew that Shem, I think, means name. Anyway, regardless, it means in English of the inexpressible name. And what it's referring to, the inexpressible name is the name of God, the Yahweh, the I will be who I will be. The name that the Jews avoid pronouncing or saying. And this pamphlet was reprinted in 1596. Now, Martin Luther had been dead by this time, decades after this particular, I think, down on the bottom here, it's 1596 in Roman letters. Why I present this one is because this pamphlet was pretty popular and it got printed even after his death. And that makes it even sadder because of its popularity once you realize what this is all about. So on this cover, you can see there's this hog and there's a bunch of individuals down below. They're actually sucking on the teats of this, I guess it's a sow. Is that how you pronounce it? A female hog. And then there's supposed to be a rabbi lifting up the tail of this sow and peering into the rear end of the pig. I don't think I would put that on the cover of any pamphlet that I would ever produce. Martin Luther thought differently, or at least by 1596, someone thought differently. In this pamphlet, I'm just give you a little bit what he said here. He had pointed out, he wrote, quote, if he were a Jew, he would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. So he's on track as far as, keeping with his earlier observation. What I want to jump to, because you'll see, we'll get back into the artwork aspect here. In this pamphlet, he makes reference to an architectural element in the church that he preached at. Well, here's a kind of a blow up. You can see a little bit better of what's on this pamphlet. All right, so in this pamphlet, he writes this, and we'll get back to the artwork here because he makes reference to it. So, carved here, this is Martin Luther's words in this pamphlet, carved here in Wittenberg on our parish church is a sow, a female pig, carved in stone. Also young piglets with Jews among them who suckle. So I guess there's some little pigs there. I don't have my glasses on. Behind the sow stands a rabbi who raises the right of the sow leg up, and with his left hand he pulls the tail over himself, stooping forward and looking with great diligence under the tail inside the sow in the Talmud being one of the Jewish holy books. As he wants to read and see something incisive and peculiar, here they certainly have their Shem Hamforas. So what he's trying to say is that on his church, there's a sculpture of what you see there in that pamphlet, which is, I think, the reason why that illustration got put on the cover of his pamphlet. And what he's trying to say was that these Jews here are trying to receive some insight into the divine name by looking into the rear end of a pig. And that's a pretty big insult. So the Shem, again, Shem Hamforas is the reference to the divine name. So I want to jump ahead and I want to show you what he's talking about. Actually, let me hold on. I got another quote here. The irony is?
The irony is it's the same God that Christians worship, you know? So,
I think Martin Luther might argue otherwise, but.
yeah, true, yeah. But
Because, I mean, you'll go on and you'll find references where the Jews are the children of the devil. So you could argue, you know, the popular devil is in fact their God. So yeah, I know, it is the same God. In fact, you know, it's like Martin Luther had amnesia and he forgot about what he wrote some 20 years earlier. This is the very attitude that he was referring to as far as why the Jews have no interest in Christianity, this type of behavior. And this is the leader of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, saying this stuff. Okay, so in this pamphlet, he also goes, he writes, see if I've got it up on the screen. Here it is. My opinion is not to write against the Jews as I was hoping to convert them. So this is what I was saying earlier. That was his goal. And I have, in that earlier book mentioned, I did not want to call it against the Jews. Now, I will share the book he's referring to in a little while. But rather, he wanted to call the book, which I'll share with you shortly, On the Jews and Their Lies, so that we Germans know historically what a Jew is and to warn our Christians about them as of the devil himself, and to strengthen and honor our faith, not to convert the Jews who are as possible to convert as the devil. I mean, this is like a flip of the switch. This is not the same Martin Luther that wrote, you know, the words that I shared with you some 20 years earlier. He goes on, because a Jew or Jewish heart is so stone hard, hard as iron, devilish hard, it cannot be moved in any way. If Moses and all the prophets came to do all the miracles in front of their eyes, that they should leave their heart and mind, as Christ and the apostles before them did, it would be in vain. If they, the Jews, were also punished as a result of the rejection of Christ so cruelly that the streets ran full of blood, that one would expect to count their dead not by 100,000 but by 10,000. He goes on, in summary, these are the children of the devil, damned to hell. However, if something human is in them, then to such may this writing come to benefit and good. Whoever will may hope for the whole bunch. I have no hope, neither does the scripture know of any. And these are actually the sentiments I just share with you that you will find on page 1. That's how you opened your pamphlet, talking about the Jewish people. This is definitely a change of tone, drastic change in tone compared to the quotes I shared with you earlier, where Martin Luther compared Christians to behaving worse than beasts when it came to the way Christians had historically treated the Jewish people. It's as if Martin Luther had forgotten what he had written some 20, 30 years earlier. Now, you might find this following historic fact of interest. The German Nazi Party in the 1930s and 1940s used this pamphlet to build up anti-Semitism in Germany. They actually tried to get German schools to incorporate what's found in this pamphlet into the curriculum of the schools in the 1930s and 1940s.
Is it possible that it's falsely attributed to Martin Luther? I mean, to have such a drastic change?
Are you saying this wasn't written by Martin Luther?
I'm asking if it's possibly falsely attributed to him.
No, because he makes reference to, there'll be another book that's written by Martin. I mean, I have found no historian. The most that you might claim is that it was not fairly translated into English. I've heard that, but honestly, if you read stuff, there's no way in the world there could be any misunderstanding as far as the sentiment. And this fits. There's also some. If you learn Martin Luther, he not only goes after the Jews, he goes after the Anabaptists, anyone who didn't agree with his Lutheran form of Reformation. He attacked. He became extremely bitter when he died, it's very, very sad to see what happened to Martin Luther. But no, I have never come across any suggestion that these were not Martin Luther's writings. And the Germans go on, and you'll see when I bring up World War II, how the German people believed these writings were from Martin Luther. So if it was some type of false attribution to Martin Luther, then, I mean, it's quite a deception, not only historians, but the German population. You'll see as we get into this. So, I made reference to how he made reference to in his pamphlet here, and how this engraving came from an actual architectural element in the church. So this is Martin Luther's church. You call it his home church, where he would preach majority of his sermons in Germany. And you can't see it from here. So it's this back corner. This is the back of the church. And I'm going to zoom into this. And you can see it a little bit better here. This is what Martin Luther was referring to. And notice the bird up there making his nest. So when Martin Luther wrote his pamphlet, and you also think about it, Jace, I mean, this is Martin Luther's church. And this is on his church. And the pamphlet is making reference to, this is on my church, or the church that here in Wittenberg. So it just seems very hard to believe that it's not Martin Luther's pen. It's still there. You can go there today. In fact, there's a large outcry. People are trying to get the thing taken down, but you kind of have to think about this. Like, would you want to knock down Auschwitz and just bulldoze it and put up a shopping center? There's actually a good point of argument you can make for leaving something this anti-Semitic, but the Jewish people, I believe, very much dislike this. In all fairness, let me see, it doesn't show it here. If I back out, there is, right below here, I can't tell, there's actually a little plaque so people can read, and you can understand what the people of, I guess the officials of Wittenberg thought that this should be put there, just as, I guess the same reason why Auschwitz is still standing today as a testimony of anti-Semitism. It's a historic fact, so as distasteful as it is to many, and especially to the Jewish people, you can make an argument why it should be kept. And the sculpture dates back to the 1300s, so it predates Martin Luther by roughly 200 years. So it dates back to the 14th century. And at that time, it would have been a Roman Catholic church, of course, because the Reformation didn't occur until the 1500s. But Luther, even after breaking with the Catholic Church, felt it right to leave this sculpture on his church as he preached it. I mean, can you imagine having something like that on the corner, well, maybe on the back corner of our building? Again, all this type of artwork and writing, just imagine how this just infiltrates society and the thinking of Christians. So this pamphlet I was sharing with you here wasn't the only anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Judaism work of Martin Luther. His most notorious, or should I say infamous, his most infamous writing was a 65,000-word treatise published in the same year as this pamphlet. This was in 1543. And the 6,500-word treatise was titled On the Jews and Their Lies, and that's what he was referring to in the pamphlet. So again, the one refers to the other. So if one's been falsely attributed, then the other one has to also be falsely attributed. And the fact that this was reprinted so frequently, it was even during Martin Luther's life. So if it was falsely attributed to him, you would think Martin Luther would have said something, say, hey, this is not me, just disclaim that. So you can feel pretty confident that this is from the pen of Martin Luther. So the larger tome, the infamous work of his was called On the Jews and Their Lies. Let's see if I got a copy of that. Here we go. So you can kind of see the original.
Hey, Phil, quick question. So, I mean, just actually more just a thought. Like, this almost seems, unless there's like some sort of direct catalyst, you would almost think that this is almost like God hardening the heart of Martin Luther to fulfill his purpose.
Well, there is a little story. I don't know how much to put faith into it as far as why he turned on. I mean, yeah, okay, so he did not succeed in converting the Jews, but he also had a meal with the Jews, and he ended up with a horrible case of diarrhea. So some people just think that kind of like the last straw. He actually then started thinking, they're trying to kill me. They're trying to kill me. Okay. So there are some reasons why he would change. But the change is like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, if I've got the analogy right. It is quite a flip from being extremely insightful to actually being part of the problem that he himself could put his finger on as to why the Jews had no interest in Christianity.
Was it progressive? Like it wasn't like small steps in his writing?
No. He spent most of his time writing like Bible commentaries, but he did take time to attack the Jews. It was like within the last 2-3 years of his life, he went after the Jewish people. But yeah, most of his writings, you'll find a lot. He has like 50 volumes worth of writings, and most of it's like on books of Galatian and Romans, New Testament. So between the years 1543 and 1546, this particular book on the Jews and their lies went through 3 different editions. I mean, that tells you how popular this book was in Germany. It was in high demand. So what makes this book so infamous? I'm going to play a clip from a book called When a Jew Rules the World. And in this clip, you'll get a little taste of what's found in the Jews and their lies. And it actually adds a little bit more to it. I've read this book multiple times. It's been very influential for Lisa. I remember one of the first things that when Lisa and I were dating, I shared with her this particular book, and it really changed her thinking toward the Christadelphians and toward our hope. And I can remember at the end of this book, she said, I never was comfortable with Christians going to heaven and that being our hope. And this book actually talks about a restoration of the kingdom of Israel and the Messiah's reign on earth. And I can remember driving, and after we finished this, and she said, I really, really like this idea of a kingdom of God on earth. But the book actually starts out talking about anti-Semitism. That's its focus, like for the first quarter of the book. Anyway, I'm going to share a clip from it. This comes from Audible. I have misgivings, even though it's very influential as far as changing my wife's mind toward our faith. It goes on and talks about more of an evangelical. The author is a mainstream evangelical, so he brings up a lot about Satan and Antichrist in the end days. So the last half of the book I really don't like at all, but it was the focus on anti-Semitism and the kingdom of God on earth, and that's where When a Jew Rules the World, the title comes from. So I'm going to play this clip here. It comes from the Audible book version. All right, Walter, I hope we don't have this. I should have tested this before. All right. I think one time we tried trying to close this. I do actually have as an MP3 file too. I remember one week we couldn't get anything to play. We had to get the microphone brought up front. All right, let's see if we can get back. All right. Slideshow from current slide. Nope, we're not getting anything. Okay. Well, let me try playing the MP3, and if that doesn't work, we know it's not PowerPoint. All right, where's the play? It's not even, there we go. All right, so there's something wrong with, because we have this player here, and we also have PowerPoint, and neither is playing anything. Let's try this.
Solution.
We got that working.
Luther's treatise offered his solution in no unclear terms.
So can we just get the microphone up here? Because we'll have to end up doing the same thing we did last time. All right.
Just 3 years before his death in 1546, Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, wrote an anti-Jewish treatise titled On the Jews and Their Lives. For more than 1,000 years, Christians throughout Europe had debated among themselves about how they should treat the Jews living in their midst. By Luther's day, some argued that the problem of the Jews called for a definitive solution. Luther's treatise offered his solution in no unclear terms. I'll allow his own words to speak for themselves. What then shall we Christians do with this damned and rejected race of Jews? First, their synagogues should be set on fire, and whatever does not burn should be covered or spread over with dirt, so that no one may ever be able to see a cinder or stone of it. And this ought to be done for the honor of God and of Christianity, in order that God may see that we are Christians. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed, for they perpetrate the same things there that they do in their synagogues. For this reason, they ought to be put under one roof or in a stable, like gypsies, in order that they may realize that they are not masters in our land as they boast, but miserable captives. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. Next to the devil, a Christian has no more bitter and galling foe than the Jew. Most Christians who read Luther's words for the first time are shocked. Tragically, Luther was far from alone among notable Christian leaders in his hatred and abuse of the Jews. As we will see, his attitude was actually quite common among Christians throughout an overwhelming majority of church history. Even more tragically, roughly 500 years after Luther wrote his hateful treatise, Adolf Hitler would rely heavily on Luther's proposals as the basis of his own final solution, resulting in the death of 2/3 of the roughly 9 million Jews who were living in Europe at the time. How did it all come to this? How did Christianity, whose adherents claimed to follow a Jewish Messiah, become a Gentile-dominated religion that persecuted the Jews no matter where they were found? How did those Christians who claimed to worship the God of Israel come to hate the children of Israel so deeply, so passionately, and so relentlessly? To answer that question, we must begin with the words of the Apostle Paul in chapter 11 of his letter to the Romans. It is there that Paul issued a most solemn warning one specifically intended for Gentile Christians. First, Paul warned them against being arrogant toward the Jews, reminding his readers of the ongoing calling and election of Israel, including unbelieving Israel, as the people of God. Second, he also warned Gentile believers not to become conceited about their own standing before God. Instead, they were exhorted to fear. Let us read Paul's warning. Do not be arrogant toward the natural branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. Romans chapter 11, verses 18 through 22. This is an absolutely profound statement. Put another way, a failure to be both informed and humble concerning unbelieving Israel could very well result in believing Gentile Christians being cut off from God.
Okay, I'll stop right there. Apologize for the failure to get the audio to work. Anyway, that gives you a little taste of the Jews and their lies, the book that Martin Luther wrote a few years before his death. And in this book, let me turn on the we got the. Here we go. Got it. It's a difficult book to get through, only because of how anti-Semitic his writing is. He goes on to write in this book on the Jews and their lies, quote, "The Jews are a base, whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, circumcision, and law must be accounted as filth." Do I have it on here? No. He goes on, "They are full of the devil's feces, which they wallow in like swine. The synagogue was a defiled bride, yes, an incorrigible whore, and an evil slut." He goes on and says that their synagogues and schools should be set on fire, and you got that from the quotation here. Their prayer books destroyed, rabbis forbidden to preach, homes burned to the ground, and property and money confiscated. They should be shown no mercy or kindness, afforded no legal protection, and these quote-unquote poisonous envenomed worms, unquote, should be drafted into forced labor or expelled for all time. He stigmatizes, Martin Luther stigmatizes the Jewish prayer as being blasphemous and a lie, and he vilifies the Jews in general as being spiritually blind and quote-unquote surely possessed by all devils. And the worst part of this book, believe it or not, there's actually a part worse than that. He states that Christians are to be blamed for failing to murder the Jews. And this is a quotation I have up here. In fact, you can see this. This is an English version translation. You can follow along. This is Martin Luther's words. "God has struck the Jews with madness and blindness and confusion of mind. So we," referring to the Christians, or I guess the German people, "are even at fault in not avenging all this innocent blood of our Lord and of the Christians, which they, the Jews, shed for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the blood of the children they have shed since then, which still shines forth from their eyes and their skin. We are at fault in not slaying them." Now, this reference here about which still shines forth from their eyes and their skin and is killing the children, this is the blood libel rumor where the Jews steal babies kill them, drain the blood from the babies, and take their blood, mix it into the matzah, and then they eat it during Passover, which is supposedly supposed to shine or give their eyes and their skin a glowing or healthy appearance. It's hard to believe that this is coming from the same guy who wrote what I shared with you earlier, making an observation as to why the Jewish people are so opposed to Christianity. I would be opposed to whatever this man was selling if I came across that type of writing. I guess we'll end it there. Anyone have any questions? This is probably one of the most difficult parts of this series, simply because of how mean and cruel-spirited Martin Luther was. But this is the result of hundreds and hundreds of years of this just percolating through the blood of the Christians and society. And this is what has brought us, why I think it's important to study this topic. I know it's, can be a little bit long as far as all the history involved, but this is where Christianity was in the 16th to 15th century. And hopefully we'll pick up next week. It's probably something we'd like to forget, but it's part of Christian history, and I think we'd be doing a disservice if we gloss over it and not take time to look at it.